more organizations die from indigestion than starvation. Over time, organizations add and add and add and spend less time thinking about subtraction, and that gets them into the situation where they're bloated. When we try to solve problems, our first instinct is to think, what can we add to make this situation better? Then consequently, we neglect this whole other class of options, which is like taking away from the existing situation to make things better. Hi, my name's Leidy Klotz. I'm a professor at the University of Virginia. I'm the author of 2 books that don't talk about AI, Subtract and In a Good Place. And I'm really excited today to talk about how the ideas in those books relate to AI.
I got to say, Leidy, I know your work has moved on since Subtract, but I refer to Subtract probably once a week. Even just last week, I pulled it off my shelf and was showing somebody and talking about it. And it comes to mind for me a lot in this age. And so I think it'd be really fun to talk about that and talk about all sorts of other stuff. But before we do, for audience members who don't kind of know the basic premise of Subtract, would you just lay that out just so everybody kind of has a common understanding of the conceptual foundation of this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, so Subtract is this book that I wrote, but also, scientific finding that was on the cover of Nature, that when we try to solve problems, our first instinct is to think, what can we add to make this situation better? And then consequently, we neglect this whole other class of options, which is like taking away from the existing situation to make things better. So that's the abstract description. A story that's really helpful with it is actually how I initially conceptualized the research study. I was playing Legos with my son, who was 3 at the time, and we were building a bridge, right? And the problem we had basically was the bridge wasn't level. And so I went to solve this problem. I turned around behind me to grab a block to add to the shorter column on the bridge. And by the time I had turned back around, he had removed a block from the longer column. And again, it's just this really crystal clear illustration of what I did in that moment is what we tend to do, which is like, here's a problem, I'm going to solve it, and I'm going to add by solving it. And if there wasn't a 3-year-old there, I would have overlooked this whole other class of options. So that's the basic idea. And it applies across, not just Legos, obviously, but how we organize our time and how we take in information and all sorts of things.
So, yeah, obviously my mind immediately goes to time. But before we go there, one thing I just am curious about is I love the simplicity of the Lego example. How is the tendency to add manifested, say, in an organizational context? Yeah, I mean, you've been studying this a lot. Where else have you seen that subtraction would be a more elegant solution, but folks don't think of it? Or am I reading too much into it to say folks don't think
I
of
mean,
it?
I think what makes it interesting is that, the real world is complex systems, and like an organization is a complex system. It's not a discrete Lego problem, but over time there's the organizations add and add and add and spend less time thinking about subtraction, and that gets them into the situation where they're bloated. I think there's a Bob Sutton always says this, and he's quoting somebody else, but more organizations die from indigestion than starvation. And I think that, and there's a lot of good reasons for this. When you're first starting something, it makes sense to have reporting lines and more employees and protocols, and you keep doing that and doing that and doing that, and don't spend as much time kind of going back and saying, okay, what no longer serves us. So that's how it might apply in like an organizational situation.
It's interesting how we talked about Scandinavia, obviously coming from Denmark and the Scandinavian design background, where it's very much been the saying here for a long time, things are not done when you can't add more to it, but when you can't take more away. And I think, then when you come into other cultures and you see how their design background, and obviously it has more audacity to it visual. And so it really resonates. I want to also just make sure that you mentioned your new book, because I think Jeremy and I implicitly love the Subtract stuff, but we talk a lot about environment design and systems design. And obviously your new work kind of like touched more about that. So do you mind just talking a little bit about your latest work?
Yeah, the next book is called In a Good Place. It comes out in April. It's about how the spaces where we live, work, and play can help us thrive. And it's basically trying to show people this connection between our physical environment and these core emotional needs that we all have for connection, growth, and agency. And so, yeah, it's very rooted in the built environment. And the Lego study Henrik, is that's Danish too, actually. But the Lego study was like kind of the spark, but my background is in engineering and architecture and design. And certainly those examples of elegant design were always kind of inspiring me. And you're wondering, like, why can't we do more of this? But I think it's also a great illustration that I think one of the reasons we don't subtract a lot is because we think it's going to be easy, because the end product looks easy. But you're exactly right that it's like, this is when you get to the classic Danish design or Scandinavian design that looks really simple, it's actually farther along the design continuum than something that's very ornate, because you have to solve the problem and then you have to say, okay, how could we keep this problem solved while taking more things away? And it's a good illustration that, the end product of subtraction is amazing, but oftentimes it's more steps to get there.
And I think, obviously that is very topical in a world where vibe coding is now makes the cost of production very easy. Have you done thinking around when you are trying to create an environment for yourself that leads you towards that good behavior of subtracting?
Yeah.
How do you contain yourself when a new idea is a Claude code prompt away, when 10 new features get added in seconds, and that you don't really we're used to live in a world of scarcity. And so our mind is very much wired at that. And this abundance kind of world is new to us. And so how do we create organization or design structures for ourselves to kind of prevent us from kind of forgrowing ourselves?
One way I think obviously is that like the cost of consuming information is now more than the cost of producing information, right? And that's a flip, and that's something, that's like a philosophical thing that I have to keep in mind, right? And not just for myself, but also for the things that I'm putting out into the world. It's like, okay, somebody's going to have to read this. Is it worth their time? Is it different enough than what else is out there? As far as I think obviously AI is a tool, right? And it can be used to exacerbate these basic tendencies that we have, and it can be used to correct them. And if you use AI as like subtractive prompts on AI, can be really helpful, right? So I think just something as simple as, okay, I've got 150 really good words here. How would you boil this down to 100 words? And it can give you ideas for that. And you could do that with code. I've heard, this isn't my area, the coding, but like when I talk to subtracting to people who are working, they're like, oh, we all have this technical debt. That's a huge problem in all these organizations. And it's actually quite simple relatively to say, okay, AI, help me clean up the technical debt, which otherwise would take a lot of time. So I think a combination of reframing your mindset about the costs of producing and consuming information, and then also, thinking about how do you use these tools to actually streamline the amount that's going out there. One more to add is just being really cognizant of like what I put. I will upload like my previous work and kind of use that to iterate on, and just being really conscious about what you're putting into the models or I use Claude and like the knowledge base, and like what I'm putting into the knowledge base. I found that putting more stuff in there doesn't help. It's putting the right stuff in there that does help.
Say more about that, or can you give an example of what's the difference between more stuff and the right stuff?
So, for example, like I've got my new book written, right? And it's like, I wrote this. This isn't, AI helped, but not like, it doesn't write as well as I do. That's like one of the things that that's one advantage that I have. So upload the book, and now I'm doing like marketing stuff. And it's like, okay, how would you pitch this podcast from the book? And it's actually more helpful to just put the chapter that is relevant to this podcast than to put the whole book, and certainly more helpful than like putting the whole book plus the table of contents plus other stuff that I've written adjacent to the book. So as powerful as it is, it does seem like it gets distracted the more things that you put in there. And if you can really no, this is the thing to work from and curate in that way, I get much better results.
There's something interesting here. Henrik and I kind of nerd out sometimes on prompt engineering, context engineering.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if there's something of a curve, so to speak, in terms of number of words and ideal output. And there's two problems that users probably face. On one end, you talk about here is providing too much context, right? I gave a whole book, and ask for marketing copy when really a chapter would have been sufficient. That's too many words. On the other end of the spectrum, I think a lot of early users of AI they've been trained by search to have the exact right 4 words, right? The
Right.
staccato marketing prompt to subtract beyond the prompt or whatever,
Yeah.
right? I'm making this up, right? It's like whatever the few, and we have been conditioned to say whatever the fewest number of words that is a magical incantation to the Google algorithm is kind of good. And there's something, it's for sure, we don't want to give too much information. And I agree, there's a laziness there. I'll just upload my book and then have it do it, right? But the
Yeah.
other danger is I give far too little information. And I find myself often, especially with early users, saying, you have to tell AI much more. And so it's this weird balance. Most people need to probably add. And then once you get in the habit of adding, then you need to be really thoughtful about, have I added too much? I don't know if your experience aligns with that.
No, yeah. I think for me, like the prompt, I actually turn off the typing and do voice on the prompt because I think I would never have put it this way, but like breaks me out of that magical Google incantation, right? It's like now I'm just talking, and that seems to get much better results and kind of frees me from like trying to refine the prompt. So definitely on the prompts, I give more information than I otherwise would have. But I still think, if you put useless stuff in there, it's not going to help the model, but you do need to, I do recognize that I'm prompting it in different ways than I would prompt Google.
Why do you think it's so difficult for us to understand this less is more kind of thesis? And what can we do to create triggers for ourselves to kind of go more into this abstract mode than the ad mode?
I mean, I think to break it down, there's two basic reasons. One is that we're just less likely to think of it cognitively. And I would argue that stretches across cultures. The second part is that it's not as accepted culturally for whatever reason. And that's where I think like the Danes have an advantage, right? Because this is something that is, so to deal with the first problem of not thinking about it, like you said, cues, I think were your exact words, but building those cues into your everyday processes and not relying on yourself to think of subtraction in the moment, right? So a simple example that I use in the book is just when you're doing your to-do list, can you also force yourself to come up with an equal amount of stop doings, right? And you could see how you'd build that into an annual review process, or you could build it into an AI prompt, right? It's like, give me 5 new headings, but also tell me which are the 5 worst headings that I should get rid of. So again, like the idea there is how do you think about where you make important decisions in your day-to-day routine or in your workflows or whatever, and then build the subtraction in so that you're not relying on yourself to think of it in the moment. That also builds in some permission, right? If you think about this in an organizational context, one of the big problems in organizations, right? If you think of yourself as a new employee, the way that you show you're doing a good job is often by like doing stuff and adding and like showing up. And so if you're able to, for people like that, show that subtraction is valued, also give them a way to make subtraction visible. So again, taking that to do and stop doing example up to maybe an annual review, right? It's like, here are the 3 things that I'm going to do. They're new and amazing next year. Well, what are the 3 things you're going to stop doing that are new and amazing next year? You're showing that it's valued. You're getting the information from the person, and you're avoiding a whole bunch of useless work in the forthcoming year. Again, building it into the process, and then, dealing with is this socially acceptable, or is this just, or a cultural norm, trying to make it so that the subtractions are noticeable. So there's a lot of ways I'm sure that people subtract to improve their lives and to improve organizations. And one of the problems is that once you've done that, it goes out of sight and out of mind, right? So we're surrounded by all these examples of like, okay, here's this book I wrote, and it's my contribution to the world. And the book, the 10 things that I didn't do so that I could write the book are not visible.
Yeah.
But yet the only reason I could write that book is thanks to those 10 things. I've got a professor friend who, she's like, oh yeah, when I was telling her about this, and she says, oh, when I say no to something, I actually leave it on my calendar. So if she says no to this committee and, I'm just too
Oh, that's
busy,
great.
like put the committee time on her calendar, and then she'll know when she's like doing her highest value work, like writing or meeting with the students, like this time brought to you by this other subject. So
One thing that might be fun also. So, my career has been all about building companies, and so this incubation process, and we have this process we call the default dead. And that is that we assume that a project should be killed. And so we put a kill date on it.
yeah,
And so if we think it's good enough to survive, we actively have to choose to kind of like make it go on instead of just keeping it. Because obviously you get stuck, and then you kind of like have stuff that lingers forever. And an entrepreneur's time is the only real value thing they have, right?
right.
And so it reminded me a little bit of, another process you can create is just to say this project will automatically die, or this meeting will automatically not happen if X have not fulfilled. So instead of having, I guess, weekly meetings, you could have like, we don't have this meeting except if these kind of like things happens.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, and that's, you're flipping the default to subtraction, which is, the opposite of what it normally is. Does everybody do that? Is that a common thing, or is it more like in
I don't think so. Like at Prehype, which is my incubator, we've just done that for a long time, because what we did see was a lot of entrepreneurs, they were told that they basically just to kind of like plow through it, and then good things would happen. And I think our mental model were just, very much Jeremy's kind of work on more idea is better. But for that to hold true and for that to be possible, you also kind of need to create, if you want to be promiscuous on the ideation, then you also need to be very disciplined about the way that you're saying no to stuff. And so the default debt just came in and has been like a pre-ibism for a while.
One thing I'm thinking about is I've got a friend at OpenAI, or I should say one of the labs, but we can say OpenAI because now we know. And one thing that Sam has been very vocal about is if there's a meeting on your calendar that isn't delivering value, let me know. And what I like is that shifts the burden of responsibility. Instead of my responsibility is to show up to meetings, it's my responsibility is to be a detective for unproductive meetings. And I think there's something about that is similar to default dead. I wanted to come back for a second to these kind of a priori, you said something, I wrote it down. So you have to have cues, so you're not relying on yourself to think of it in the moment, about the value of subtraction. I think there is kind of a meta cognitive layer here that is really interesting to me, because there's all sorts of things that we need to be aware of when we're in the moment and we're not likely to be aware of it. I mean, another one that Henrik and I have talked about at length on this show is the Einstellung bias, the tendency of a human to settle for good enough. And one of the best ways to undermine that bias is to know I'm probably going to settle, right? So just take those two. I've kind of started framing this personally for me as what I call an Odysseus contract with yourself, where just like Odysseus kind of told his men, strap me to the mast, because I know when I get in that valley with the sirens, I'm going to be tempted to use subtract. I'm going to be tempted to add, or to use Einstellung, I'm going to be tempted to satisfy for what's good enough, right? So I like the idea of an Odysseus contract. My challenge, or kind of the meta challenge to that, is it feels like there's almost an unending list of things that we should probably be aware of ahead of time, right? It's called every human cognitive bias.
Right.
How do we even think about that? So anyway, I put that out there. I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah, no, I love, I think that, well, as Henrik was describing this default to stop things, I mean, that also works against the status quo bias, right? So you could almost think of it's not as if the interventions that you would make for your Odysseus tied to the mast could deal with multiple biases, right?
Yes. Yes.
So it's not like you need to have an intervention for each one. You could just think about like, okay, here are the default patterns that are going to be the ones that most get in my way. And you don't really care about dealing with every single bias that has had an article written about it in the academic literature. You care about the ones that you think your people are most susceptible to in this situation. And then you would design your protection accordingly. I like that. I like the idea of designing that, though, deliberately, because it would also force you to think about like what's going on here, right? Because like that just awareness goes a long way when people are thinking about it.
Well, and that's the beauty of system prompts, right? With AI, it has these system prompts, which are the way I like to think about system prompts is like custom instructions, for example, is there parenthetical instructions to the model that precede your explicit instruction, right? But so these parenthetical instructions, you can take this Odysseus contract and you can tell Claude, hey, I know my tendency is always going to be to add. Please protect me against that tendency. And the system instruction can actually act as, Odysseus's sailors or whatever, which I think reduces the cognitive load or the burden on the human to have to remember that in the moment.
Right.
I think we were talking about this the other day that in getting the startup land, the About Us page is kind of good because that is something that you can emotionally connect to as a customer.
Right.
But increasingly, this About Me page that you have to give to your agents are going to be important, right? Because all these things are not necessarily default in the models. And
Yeah.
so your first principles, where you have strong biases, you probably need to write these About Me pages now for just how the models want to interact with us.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, you do kind of put in what you want for the project, but it's like the About Me is a different thing. Also, of course, like these models have the same biases that humans do, right? Like
All of them. Yeah.
Yeah, and which makes sense. I mean, but we just saw a paper came out like a couple months ago that was basically replicating our stuff that we did 5 years ago on subtraction in AI and saying like, yeah, the AI neglects subtraction the same way that humans do. And that was validating for our research, but also just a clear illustration that all of these things are baked into the AI, which makes that even more important to put About Me.
On your new work, I think all of us are trying to figure out what is the architecture of our lives in this world where we increasingly sit home alone, where we increasingly talk to bots instead of people. There is definitely this, I feel, emerging culture of everybody wants to get out a little bit more and kind of feel something. I wonder what your perspective is in what are the things that people have not designed, and that could be a physical design or kind of like a conceptual design into their lives that they should be aware of or to start to kind of plan for.
Yeah, I was listening to your pod. So it's Nicholas Thompson, right? That's the Atlantic CEO.
Yeah.
So, and I think it was him talking about the kid in the bathtub trying to compete with the phone. It might have been one of you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
It was one of our friends who had mentioned that. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So the idea being that like, okay, my kid's in the bathtub, that's giving me a certain level of dopamine, but then my phone has a notification and that overrides it, and my kid's having to compete with this thing that's really hard. And I don't know like the dopamine stats, but I kind of think about our surroundings the opposite way of that, which is like there is no freaking way that a screen can do what the world can do, right? I mean, maybe dopamine is one point, but we have evolved, survived or died based on being able to interact with the physical world around us. And we're wired to need to do that. And so even just if you look at it, a screen is whatever colors you put on there, it's still two-dimensional and basically going to one sense. It's our dominant sense, but it's still just one sense. And our surroundings are multidimensional. They hit all of our senses. They are constantly changing, and they're like hitting these deep needs that we have that have evolved, forever. So that's a mindset shift that I think is really important, that it's like, hey, if we really want to enjoy life, if we really want to be happy, we have to like re-engage in this relationship with our surroundings.
I mean, I agree. I agree philosophically. But however, having children like you do, I know, the best way to trigger an absolute meltdown is to take away the device. And what is true of children, I believe, is actually true of adults, right? I mean, people are totally addicted. So while I think philosophically, we probably agree that it feels like the built and physical world is better, there's a lot of data. I mean, there are people who are literally, whose lives are consumed with games or social media or whatever.
Right. But that's addiction, right? It's like addiction. The definition of it is it's taking you away from something better that you could be doing. And so I'm not saying it's not powerful at all. I'm not saying that, but I just like, that's not where the happiness is coming from. It's the same as alcohol, right? It's like, this is like an addiction to alcohol is not making the alcoholic happy or making them thrive. And so just remembering all the great things that are out there in that relationship with our surroundings. And, Henrik, your original question was about how do you design this? And I think some of it is just going back to to paying more attention to it, right? I mean, a lot of the ways that we've made it easier to navigate in the world. So like GPS is an example, right? Now you don't have to know directions as well. And again, I'm not saying don't use GPS. I'm just saying that some of these technological advances have taken us away from this relationship. Same with even just air conditioning, right? Or sealing off buildings so that they can heat and cool to a specific temperature. And now you don't need to know about opening windows and getting airflow through, and which cuts you off from the external environment. So just like engaging with your physical surroundings more, I think is a big kind of first step towards designing it, because it's not so much like the exact design, it's more that you're doing it. It's like that you're now designing.
But I wonder if you have to design things. The problem with the real world is, outside of my 6-year-old who goes, daddy, 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 which is kind of like its own notification system.
Right.
Going for that walk with my dog, or going to have a cup of coffee with my wife, whatever, like all these things that I really enjoy. What they don't have is a little red number in front of it, right? What they don't have is something that flash in front of my eyes.
100%.
And so I almost feel that, and maybe there's a statement meant as a question, but I wonder what there are of systems out there where you can almost like, it sounds pathetic, but reverse engineer a little bit like the notification universe of the screens that makes us so addicted, and then
Actually create
make them
that
available in, yeah.
What one can I?
My wife would go around saying, "Ding."
Well, let me point to one paper, because I think I've been thinking about this paper a lot. I think it's relevant, and maybe it will even abstract beyond the kind of, call it, digital world a little bit. Clay Christensen, the Innovator's Dilemma, Harvard Business School professor, when the graduating class of 2010 was leaving Harvard Business School, it was a very different world than they entered into, right? In 2008, the market crashed and they're leaving, and they wanted Christensen to talk to them not about disruption, but about personal lives. How do they make decisions that matter? And Christensen delivered what became one of the most famous speeches at Harvard Business School, that later became one of Harvard Business Review's most famous articles, which later became a book as well, called How Will You Measure Your Life? And what Christensen basically observed is, what's true for organizations is true for individuals. The marginal cost decision that organizations make that lead them to make wrong strategic decisions are just as true for humans. And he basically observed that we tend to over-rotate. I'm obviously simplifying here, but as humans, we tend to be gratified by immediate feedback and rewards. And so we tend to invest the marginal unit of effort towards that which gives us immediate feedback. And so he said, for example, at my job, I get a quarterly performance review, or I close the deal, or I write the book, or whatever, right? And so I'm getting feedback. He said, whereas with my kids, I don't learn if I'm a good dad. I don't put my hands on my hips for like 20 years and say, honey, we did it, right? And so he said, what he's observed is people, therefore, when they have an additional 30 minutes, they say, I'm going to invest it in work because I get the immediate feedback. This predates certainly AI, but this observation largely predates the social media revolution. And to me, it speaks to something about our hardwiring. And I have been thinking a lot about this in the age of AI, because now the competition isn't between kind of, say, dinner time with my family and 1 unit of work, make it incremental progress on the book. Now with these Iron Man suits, it's like 10 units of work or 100 units of work. And I was already struggling as an unwired human to make the decision for my family, per Christensen's framework. Now I feel, what hope do I have to choose between kind of the unwired 1 unit of time and 100 units of output that my competitors are doing? Does that resonate? And if so, how can we start to design, given that the economic incentives are being stacked even harder against us?
Yeah, I agree. This concept of bike shedding, that's something I talk about in my next book, but it's basically the classic illustration of this is there's a committee convened to talk about a nuclear power plant, the construction of a nuclear power plant, and they have a meeting, get all the important stakeholders there, and they're talking about the nuclear power plant, and the engineers and architects present, and people ask some softball questions because they don't really understand, and we get past this discussion of the nuclear power plant in like 15 minutes, and then there's time left in the meeting, and so they're like, well, what should we do at this time? And they start talking about the bike shed that's going next to the nuclear power plant, and everybody has an opinion, because it's just easier to grasp, right? So it's like, okay, what color should it be painted? What kind of racking system should we have? And everybody can talk about the bike shed. And I think it's that's where the name comes from, but it's basically this tendency to prioritize small and knowable things over big, meaningful, unknowable things like, what's going to happen to your kid. Because it's like, yeah, it's 20 years down the road. Plus, you're never going to be able to connect the specific thing that you did in that moment to a positive or negative outcome. It's just messy.
Right.
You're moving the needle a little bit. You hope you are. I think part of that is, kind of relentlessly focusing on what matters, right, for yourself. But then also for the people that you're working with or that are working for you, is like continually, like at the nuclear plant example, if you brought to them the actual things that were important that they could talk about the nuclear power plant, instead of maybe the engineering details, you talk about, okay, these are the 3 basic safety approaches, and here's how we should talk about them. And I really want your opinion on them. So breaking it down into like important but manageable. But yeah, that's a fundamental way of thinking that predates
But it
AI.
seemed to come back to, I think,
Mhm.
the premise of your book of we have this other prehybridism that we call structures define outcomes. And
Yeah.
that seemed to be even more important as you're just describing it. I have date night every Friday with my wife.
Right.
And we have at least once a week where we walk the dog. And it's
Yeah.
like a religious thing, right? Like we always,
Yeah.
hey, nobody messes with date night. And I really think that it is so easy to cancel the date night, right? Because like there's stuff that comes up and
Yeah.
hopefully we'll be married for 15 years, or hopefully we'll be married forever. And so it does seem to me that when you have the issue that Jeremy outlined, we almost have to get these things into some kind of like architectural system for ourselves. Because otherwise, of course, dinner time will lose out when you can otherwise do 100 people's work.
It's
Right,
almost
like it
like
is-
it's almost like Stephen Covey's. Have you seen this illustration of the sand and the rocks? If you put the sand in the jar first, you can't fit any rocks in. There's no room. But if you
Okay.
put
Yeah.
the rocks in first, this is like, 7 habits of highly effective people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Find your big rocks, put them in first, and then you can pour the sand in, and sand will fill all the way around it, right?
Mm.
And to me, the phrase that came to my mind as I was thinking about this is big rocks before bots. Like you have to know what are your big rocks, and then Henrik, to your point, right? You may not know this, Leidy. Henrik is helping thousands of entrepreneurs start new companies.
Yeah. I
It
saw
sounds
that.
like, Henrik, if I put this framework in your life, Henrik has premeditated, not on Friday night, I'm not helping thousands of companies, right? And he's decided that my time with my wife is so important that the sand's got to fit around that.
Uh-huh.
And this it highlights the importance of these very human decisions and establishing, as Henrik, as you're saying, architecting systems to protect us from our baser impulses, right? If you're wondering on Friday afternoon whether you should keep helping 1,000 entrepreneurs or do dinner with your wife, you probably go,
I'll add another one. That I use OpenClaw, the new bot, for some stuff. And one I've asked it now is that I work New York hours, but I'm often in Europe. And so the
Mhm.
night tend to get long and I want to get sleep and my kids wake up in the morning. But so I've now gave the bots a command saying, I aspire to basically be sleeping by 11 o'clock. And so now at 10:30, all the bots are just going like, hey, I'll ask them like, can you install this new thing? And they're like, I can do that, but it's coming up to 11 o'clock. So should we push it to
Mm.
tomorrow, dude?
Yeah.
And it's kind of interesting. Like I have to hack myself. Otherwise I'm just so easily seduced by these things that I'll stay up all night.
Yeah. I think going back to your question about the design prompts to like re-engage with the world too, right? I mean, you could use something as simple as like when I'm looking at my phone, like space before screen. So I look at my phone as like, wait, have I checked out this place that I am, right? Like really taking it in. And so you can, knowing that the addictive power of the phone, you could certainly use that to help you engage with your surroundings more. I'm sure there are things that you could, like build in ways that the technology could augment our regular experience in the world, right? Like, hey, now look over here or whatever. And as simple as like just getting the phones out of the system, right? Or getting the screens out of the system. So,
It's change the default, right? That's like, that's behavior design 101. Just
I
eliminate
saw
the
somebody
phone.
who had made a shortcut where before you open one of the social media apps, it basically asks you to breathe 3 times, and
Right.
then it goes like, "Do you still want to open it?"
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a nice little hack.
That's so good. There's something about mantras. I mean, I'm just riffing with you all now, but I've heard a bunch of structures, defined outcomes, default sorry, default dead. That's different. Leidy, you saying space before screen. I wonder if there's something about encoding these truths in catchy, almost like you could think about it as choruses, right? There's a reason earworms tend to stay in your head, right? I wonder if one way, and I love, by the way, Henrik, your statement to hack yourself. I wonder if one way to hack ourselves is to define what are these mantras in kind of a memorable slogan so that our kids can repeat it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
You
agree.
guys
I
into
couldn't
that?
think of
You
it.
guys into that?
No,
There's a weird silence there.
No. But I just feel I've interrupted and spoken so much, and I feel guilty when we have such an incredible guest on,
No.
and then I'm like grabbing the microphone all the time. But I will give you one more of these sermons. So a few one. I have this one that I call "Making is Thinking," which is where often I feel like instead of getting stuck, I basically start to kind of do something, which I really enjoy too. I stole it for somebody, but now it's mine.
Well, that was one thing that I wanted to bring up in this conversation about AI, right? Because I see students and I see how I work, and it's definitely like making is thinking, right? And if the AI takes out the making process, you're not doing the thinking, and you just got to, again, it's like, of course, there are times when you don't want to do the thinking. It's very rote and boring, but there are also other times where it's like, no, the thing here is the thinking, and that's where I'm getting the benefit, and I can't subtract that out.
But I guess there's a little bit of that because you do subtract that. That is often what you subtract now, and to Jeremy's laziness point, right? We do become these cognitive, diabetics where we've kind of like have basically said yes so many times to the bot that we just forget that sometimes we have to, stop and go like, hey, wait a minute, like, should I just think like it sounds compelling, but is this really the best argument? And so even the trick saying, don't suggest me one thing, suggest me 3 widely different things.
Yeah.
Because at least then you're self-prompted to kind of have a decision about them instead of just taking what is the other one? The devil is in the default.
David Epstein's written some interesting stuff about this on his Substack about just like the cognitive ease and like the deficits there, or the risks there. And we're thinking about it as people who have like, we've learned what we've learned without AI, right? So for us, it's like, yeah, there's a little bit of a harm because we're not doing our peak thinking. But when I see college students do this, or when I think about my 11-year-old doing this, it's like, not only are they not getting the ideal outcome, but they're not even learning how to do the thing, right? And so they're not developing this capability that makes them better in some way than AI, which is super scary.
And concerningly, I think actually this is, maybe it's too big, it's a societal thing, but concerningly, the things that we as experienced individuals and managers and leaders have delegated to younger people that give them the ability to do it, we're now able to prompt AI to do. And now young folks are no longer given the at-bats, like the failures required to get to success are being eliminated because now we can prompt an AI to do it and manage it. It's an interesting challenge societally to think about the opportunity for learning by doing and learning by making is being eliminated perhaps for a class of people, at least in the conventional workplace kind of apprenticeship model of on-the-job training, cognitively especially.
Well, you all have to turn this into a mantra, but yeah, I think the thing that I see, and the last thing I would want is people not to be using AI. Like when I talk to my students, you guys, you need to understand what this can do, but you also need to understand what you can do that it can't do. And so it's like this engaging but also being deliberate about how we're splitting up the tasks.
So on the cheat sheet of your new book, one is to, per the bike shed argument, try to atomize some of these bigger kind of decisions or problems that you have to solve so they are easier, more palatable. The rocks are smaller, if you like. What are some of the other things that, as you're talking to your students and you think they might not read your book? What is the thing that they should make sure they think of?
With the new, I mean, I think the space before screen is the first part, and the just getting engaging, right? Whatever it's going to take to engage with your surroundings. I think the next one is, it's not so much the exact design. It's like having a say in the design. Like it feels good to have some level of control over your environment. And that is something that they all have the opportunity to do.
Could you give an example of that?
Well, so like open office versus closed office, right? There's like every 10 years, there's a new article in the New Yorker that's arguing the opposite of what the one 10 years before about which is better. It's like, of course, it depends on the details and the company and so on and so forth. But I'd argue that what's more important than the office layout is whether people feel like they have a say in the office. Do people feel like they have some control over being in this space and over how this space works, right? And so it's things like, okay, yeah, you can give them if they have an office that they can design, that's one thing. If they have a cubicle that they're allowed to modify, so that's flexibility of the space, but also like the legibility of the space. You think about these offices where people come in and they're, if they don't know how to get to the shared rec room or they feel like the shared rec room is off limits, then it's not serving its purpose. So like making it flexible, making it legible so they can see how to use it. I think that's an example of where like agency is this thing that is so fundamental and should be the first consideration that we have in designing and making spaces. And yet we go to paint colors, right? And because it's easier to think about.
When we did BarkBox, one of the things that I think we did well was I designed them as homes where you could work from instead of basically offices.
In the office?
Because I wanted, so on the floors, there was a huge kitchen. And that was because that's always where the cool kids hang.
Right.
But also it's such a natural place to kind of relax and kind of like turn off your way of thinking. And what we observed was that people really felt at home, and it became a place where we didn't have to bribe people for the drinks, because it was just a nice place to be. And so I always said it's easier to make a office, a kitchen or a home efficient than it is to make kind of like an office cozy. And obviously in Denmark, we have this notion of hygge, which is this kind of like
I love hygge.
Artificial created intimacy. And it really works. Same thing, like people could bring their dogs to the office, but a normal office didn't have a place for dog and human to be together. And so we created these kind of sofa seating areas that was not sofa, but they were more like these boxes that kind of like sat around different places where you could cuddle up with your dog, and there would be like a place where the leash could be and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, like all the stuff you're saying super resonate, because like I've seen the actual result of how you can affect culture by creating a space that promotes a different type of feeling.
Yeah. And I mean, that's amazing. I'm writing an article for the Wall Street Journal now about that. And I'll have to look. Are there pictures online of the...
Yeah. You just search BarkBox office, then they'll come up.
And also, if you think about what's nice about a home, it's like, yeah, I control this. Like I can do what I want in this space. And so that's really cool. And one of the other ways to kind of give them that agency is to force the agency opportunities, right? So maybe you don't feel like moving the furniture around, but if you go into a kitchen, now all of a sudden you have to like search around, find the stuff, maybe you decide where to set your food, and all of a sudden you're interacting with the surroundings, which is, I mean, that's the ultimate like hacking, where you're not just giving them a reminder, you're actually having them physically do it. So that's really neat.
I feel like
there's always three things.
Oh,
but I want more.
You want three things?
You want three. Growth. I think the growth hack is like, we don't do a great job of moving amongst the spaces to which we have access. And so I think, how can you explore spaces that are like beyond the edge of your comfort zone? Whether that's, someplace that you don't go in your office, some new way to use your house. There's an example in my book that everybody seems to love is like one of my friends, the Lees, they have 4 kids. And at the time they did this, all 4 of the kids were like under 7. So it was insane. And they, it's like your life, Jeremy, but they had So what they had done, I asked them how it was going, like I asked you at the beginning of this conversation, Henrik, and they said, it's going great. We've taken to eat dinner outside. And I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, no, like outside is just the default for dinner all throughout the year. And they're like, it's like expanded our square footage. It's made it so that when the kids spill, we don't even care. It's made it so that when they get done eating, they can like run around and not disrupt everybody's dinner. It's quieter, blah, blah, blah. It's so much better. And this was like a space that they had available to them. And it just required them to like go a little bit outside of their boundaries and kind of fundamentally changed how they were living. And so if you can think about analogs to that, whether it's how you move through your day or whether it's like your personal space, just using spaces that you have available to you in different ways.
And I guess you put an AI spin to it, as Jeremy were talking about, and you were mentioning too, like this ability now that to talk to your agent is probably allow you to say, hey, I have 30 minutes where I have to think through something. I'll go for a walk and basically just put on Grok or ChatGPT or whatever, and then have a conversation as I'm going through the forest is probably useful.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's certainly one of these amazing new capabilities that we have that we should totally take advantage of. And we process things differently based on the spaces that we're in, right? So if you think about the things that you remember, they're often associated with a place, right? So it's like maybe it's a field trip from middle school, just by taking you out of this familiar environment into a new environment. So you could even like align the walk with what you're hoping to do on the task, right? So if you want to think of new ideas or you want to remember this thing, then go somewhere new. I do this with parenting, with my son. If it's like an important conversation, I will talk to him about it in a neat spot, just hoping that
by now he's going to be freaked out. Like you go like that. We haven't been here before. What are we going to talk about?
Here comes the birds and the bees talk.
But so Leidy, I'll give you a gift in closing.
Okay.
We at the D School, we tell folks to take a wander, which is basically what you're saying. It's like take a walk with your problem. Yeah. When you take a walk with your problem, I borrowed the actual physical idea from Sister Curate Kent, who is the nun in charge of the School of the Immaculate Heart, this like radical art program. And she would teach art students to make a finder, which is basically what's written on it. I'll tell you in a second, but basically it's a piece of cardboard with a hole through it. And they had to, as they walked around, they had to look at the world through the hole, and it basically constrains your vision. And then she would give art assignments where, like if I say I looked at the screen like this, my assignment is to draw only what I see here, but now make it 10 times bigger, right? And then take this and actually look at my drawing and make another drawing, but only of what I see through this of my drawing. So she would do stuff like that. Well, I basically borrowed that idea and said, hey, if you have a problem you're trying to solve, one way to think outside of the box is to get outside of the box. So literally stand up, take your problem, and you can just say, how would insert the blank do blank or solve blank? And so you go, hey, we're trying to build trust. And you go on a walk around the neighborhood. You're like, and you see a UPS truck and you're like, how does UPS build trust? Oh, brown. They have a color that signifies, deliverability, right? And then you look at the playground and you go, how does a playground build trust? Oh, the ground is soft. Okay, what bearing does that? But all of a sudden, by having a problem in mind and by constraining your vision, the world starts serving up solutions to you that when everything's available to you, actually you can't find, right?
Yeah.
It's a fun one.
It is a fun. I'm not saying anything because it's not good. I do that with my students in class. I have a class on like sustainability in the built environment, and it'll go outside and be like, okay, look at how would this leaf solve this problem? I don't have the box. That would be a better way to do it because the artificial constraint actually makes it better in that case.
Yeah. Because you can't say how would the world solve this problem? That's too big. And actually, that's a really interesting analog to AI. When you ask AI a question, you are saying, how would the internet answer?
Right.
When you provide constraints, you're actually focusing, I don't want the internet's answer. I want the leaf's answer or whatever it is, which is kind of a cool full circle connection I hadn't thought of.
That's awesome.
That's
hey, thank you so much for spending
Well done,
time.
Leidy. Well done.
Jeremy Utley.
Henrik Vertelen, what do you think?
As we we talked about, like, I had a good friend who passed recently, and I think, as we were talking off air on this, and I'm listening to this, like, I am really a victim of my fascination of AI and its seductive nature. And so what I think really hit home for me was what I think is the task for at least myself, but I would imagine for a lot of other people, of figuring out how do we create an architectural environment around ourselves that allow us to have a balanced relationship with this magical technology, but still not have it suck us in for time, not have us suck us in for laziness of thought, not having sucked in for biases that we have in the world that is encoded into the technology and all these different ones. So, I mean, like, he was inspiring and had incredible energy. And I always kind of like pretty humbled by being able to have a conversation with somebody like that. But for me, actually more profound because it suddenly was an hour spent and the vocalization of this kind of feeling that I haven't expressed, which is, hey, I need to probably start to create guardrails for my own behavior with AI. So.
Mm, mm. Yeah, the notion of protecting ourselves against our, baser impulses, perhaps, or our, at least, not to say base, but a very natural impulse to doing more. And I love your examples around having your agents check in with you. Hey, it's kind of getting close to bedtime. Are you sure you want me to do this? To me, just to pay you a compliment, it sounds like you're already beginning to architect some of that environment. And I realize with your friend's passing, there's the additional kind of weight of thinking about this question: are we living right? And I think it's actually, funeral or no funeral, memorial or no memorial, we're all going to face that day. Our lives will come to an end. And thinking, are we spending our time in a way that we will be proud of, I think is a really important question. And I thought the example of, your date night ritual with your wife, could you be more productive? Probably. Could the world get more startups out of Henrik if he spent his Friday nights supporting entrepreneurs? Probably. But it almost makes me wonder, what is Henrik for? Just to put it to you, right? And one thing is, yeah, sure, to facilitate and to unleash entrepreneurship. But I think another is to be a husband to your wife. And you have to, in an age where it's so easy to keep commissioning agents to build more startups, to say, one thing an agent cannot do is be a husband to my wife.
Mhm.
How do I protect that which is irreducibly mine? I think is a question on everybody's minds.
And that resonated a lot. I mean, like, I was making the joke with my wife the other day because, like, I had installed OpenClaw and I was excited about it. And I called my agent Iki. And then I was lying in bed before bedtime and I was like, hammering away on my phone, talking to Iki. And she goes, "You rather want to talk to Iki right now than you want to talk to me." And I was like, kind of. And, it was a joke, right? But, like, also horrible because obviously this kind of synthetic thing that I could talk to at any time. So I do think it is very important. And I do also reminded of, so at Autos, the startup that I do that help entrepreneurs, we are building thousands of startups. And the other day I had a journalist from The Economist be on, and we went through this whole process and we built his startup and we started to run ads and have the first potential customers come in. And in the middle of it, he goes, "Yeah, I can see how this could be a business, but I don't want to make this." And so I think, and I alluded to it also in the conversation, I do think that we are at this interesting point where we have to articulate our principles and our narratives because we have to be able to tell it to the bot so it can help us become a better version of what we would, the version that we'd like to be. I had this phrase, you asked for a phrase called, your narrative is your source code. And I do think that we as humans have not necessarily had to define our source code, our being, our values, because we never had anybody that could help us as fast and could basically move us forward as fast as this technology. And I really think that without taking stock of, would I want to build this startup? Is this a startup for me? Or would I like to write this email in this way? Or would I like to push forward this idea, whatever it is? And then, we'll go wherever the model will take us instead of where we would like it to go.
Yeah. Knowing oneself has never been more important. And I love actually the mechanism of a mantra or a motto, something that's, pithy, repeatable, almost sing-songy in quality. I think as we think about being parents, having mantras like the space before screen, I love
Mm,
that as a
I love that.
mantra. I love default dead. I love structures define outcomes. I think it's important that we codify these, and they can't be universal values or else they're already in the model. They have to be particular. They have to have unique resonance with you personally, your family. And that's what in the entrepreneurial space, you'd probably call founder market fit or something, right?
Mm,
But personally, it's about alignment
mm,
and growing in alignment with our values, which I love. One other thing I want to highlight from the conversation is this idea of system instructions or custom instructions to tell the model or to invite the model's assistance in helping you think in the way you want to think.
mm.
If you don't want to fall subject to the addition bias, why not tell the model that you actually want to look for opportunities to subtract? We have an amazing uh, thought partner now that can help us stay honest to it's too late to be deploying another agent right now, Henrik. And if we'll take the time to actually codify that and instruct the model, we actually get help being more of who we want, which I think is quite cool.
It's kind of a subtle thing, right? But I think when you talk about custom instructions, I think a mental model we should instruct the AI to be in a specific way. It's where the object is the AI. But as we're realizing, of course, AI is more like electricity. It's a foundational technology. It's not like the web. So it's not like I used to have a magazine. Now I'm going to make a magazine online. And so I think the reframe is really the instruction is ironically not about the bot. It's about me. And so I have to basically look at it as a mirror and saying, when I instruct you to do stuff, what do I look like? And I don't know, for me, it sounds like a pretty profound reframe. I know it's subtle,
It's huge.
but I do actually think that most of us have not thought in this way.
Yeah, I like that Odysseus framing of
Mm.
knowing my own self, therefore, how am I instructing you to behave? I think is kind of what's interesting is think about the Iliad. I mean, is it the Iliad or the Odyssey? One of the two. I don't even know. But it's kind of an ancient story. And you go, of all the paradigms to be drawing upon now, we're drawing upon these ancient stories. It's because the things that have been true about us are even more true and even more amplified now that we have this mirror of all of human knowledge can be reflected back to us. What do I want of that? What do I want to be protected from? What's my unique, you know, constraint that I'm putting on it, so to speak?
Anything else we should add from this conversation? Thoughts?
I liked hearing about voice again. I really liked Leidy's characterization of Danish, or actually, you said this when we talked about subtract at the beginning. You said, done is when you can't take more away.
Yeah.
And I think that's a principle that could be widely relevant to many listeners. Done isn't when you can't add anything more. It's when you can't take anything away.
There's a link I should show in the show note. It's a clip from the TV show Bear, the chef show. And there's this one scene that I send to my design teams all the time, which is basically where he comes in and he's being taught something and he basically gets yelled at. And then he writes on a note, it's just subtract. And then he puts it down there. And it is such a beautiful scene. I'll share it with you and with the listeners also.
Please do hit the link there if you enjoy it. And if you enjoyed this episode, hit the other link, which is write a review or leave 5 stars. If 6 stars are available, go ahead and hit that 6 star. We appreciate it.
And with that, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.